Hey, good morning. It's great to see you here. My name is Tim, and I'm on the pastoral team at Creekside Kitchener, and I get to be here. This morning to speak to you. So I'm excited to be able to do that. I just say a warm welcome to you, and warm welcome to all of you in the West Side, and of course tuning in online and at our Chatham campus, and of course my home campus, Creekside Kitchener. It's just great to have all of you tuning in today. We are in the middle of this series that Pete started a few weeks ago called Jesus is the Answer. And we're going through the book of 1 Corinthians. And God's desire through the book of 1 Corinthians is to, that meta theme that Pete talked about is to show us about how God wants us to be a holy people. A holy people. And today, I want to say this. I want to say a couple things. First of all, we're going to dive into like a whole bunch of scripture. We're going to go through like the whole chapter of 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and a little bit of chapter 10. I also want to say this. If you're tuning in with us, or you're here, or you're at one of the campuses, and you are newer to the faith, or especially maybe you're not newer to the faith, maybe you're still curious, you're searching, and you're trying to figure out what this Christian thing, what this Jesus thing, all that kind of stuff, what it's all about. I want you to hang in with me today, okay? I want you to hang in there because some of the stuff that you're going to hear is kind of weird, and you need to understand that it's very contextual, and my heart and my desire is that by the end of this message, you will have a good understanding of maybe just kind of what Jesus would be like and what he desires his church to be like, okay? So I just want to encourage you that if that's you, that you would just hang in there this morning as we work our way through this. Listen, you got to know I love food, okay? I love food. Now, I'm kind of a plain sort of eater. That's the thing. I don't have the huge palate that some of you may have where you can go try any cuisine around the world, but I love the food that I like. For example, my favorite cuisine, I think, is Italian, okay? It's Italian. And then it's Greek, and then it's probably like Mexican food, and I just love going to local restaurants, not chain restaurants, but local restaurants, and trying that kind of food, and just kind of seeing sort of the mini culture that it creates within these places. And if you've ever been to a big city, you don't just have restaurants. It's sort of like the city sort of takes on like a food culture. You know what I mean? Some of these places, and if you've ever kind of traveled the world or even traveled North America, some of these big cities sort of have kind of like they're known for this type of food or that type of food, right? It's a big deal, this idea of cuisine. Now, in the church back in the church in Corinth, okay, so the city of Corinth in which the Corinthian church was in this ancient city, let's say there may have been upwards to about 500,000 people. Food wasn't like it is for us today in that regard. In fact, they were sort of having some tensions. They were having some severe shortages. That's what some historians were saying, that at the time this was written, there was actually maybe some shortages happening, maybe some famine happening. They weren't quite sure, but there was something going on there, so that can create tension, right? And then the other thing, which we're going to talk about today, is this idea that food was being sacrificed to idols. And Paul is going to be addressing. Remember who Paul is addressing, okay? So the Apostle Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthian church. So the Apostle Paul is writing this letter to Christians, okay? Could be Christians new to the faith to Christians who, are more mature, more experienced in the faith. And two questions kind of arise, right? Is why is Paul even talking about this? And the second part is, okay, how does this apply? I mean, how can this even apply? Okay, I can see how it might apply to them, but how will it apply to us today? And what you got to know is you got to be able to understand, and I know Pete's been doing this the last few weeks, is kind of giving us some insight into the Corinthian culture. right? We got to understand what's going on at the time, what was the culture like, and what was the surroundings like. Here's what we know, and Peter reminded us in week 1 that this culture was filled with sexual immorality. There was all kinds of crazy stuff going on, and it was just sexually immoral. It was just all over the place, front and center. As well, wealth and luxury. This was like a major port center, so there was wealth and luxury, right? There was very poor, but then there was also very wealthy as well. And they loved their wisdom. They loved to go, I know Christians in particular, right? They would love to go and argue, or they would love to go and kind of to learn, and they would argue with these wisdom teachers that would come into Corinth, and they were people who they wanted to know more. They had this idea of knowledge. So it's key to understanding those things. And in the midst of that is this church. Now, wasn't as big as it ever was at the time because, well, it had just started. So it's kind of a young church. It's a church, obviously, that's growing, but it's growing with, sure, there's Christians that are more mature, but then there's also Christians that, well, they're not quite along that same line in the journey, right? So you have a spectrum of Christians within that. And then, of course, they're immersed in this culture. And a lot of them who are being saved and they're coming to know Jesus, they're ones that are coming out of this culture, but not, right? The church is within the culture. So you've got tensions going on, right? You've got a mix of Jews and Gentiles, and they're trying to find their way, and it's not easy, but it's necessary in order for them to become the church that God desires them to become. And that's why Paul's writing them. And Paul confronts them, and he says this in 8 verses 1. I'm going to skip that there. He says, now about food sacrificed to idols. Well, why did I show you this? I showed you this because what you're about to see is that before Paul even gets into food sacrifice for idols, he's actually making a statement that this actually has more to do than just food sacrificed to idols, okay? It has a lot more to do with that. And before he says anything about food sacrifice to idols, he says, we know that we all possess knowledge. But knowledge puffs up, while love does what? It builds up. Those who think they know something, they know something, do not yet know as they ought to know. So he talks about this idea that you've got knowledge and then you've got love, right? And we need to understand and remember that they took a lot of pride in what they knew. Right? They came from this society, from this culture where knowledge was just like the greatest thing, and I want to get wiser, I want to know more. And what would happen is, of course, they would come into their Christian context, and you would also have Christians who say, I want to know more, I want to be wise. And if that was the focus, he's saying, listen, knowledge is like, it puffs you up if you're not careful. You know what I mean by puffed up? It's kind of like someone walking around, they have their chest out because they know everything. And they even have the strut. You ever seen those people? They got the strut happening, right? Those kinds of people, what we might call the know-it-alls. Does anybody know a know-it-all? Right? Spouses, stop looking at each other, right? Teens, stop looking at your parents. Parents, stop looking at your teens. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's a neighbor. They know it all. Now, how do you feel when you're around these people? I'm not going to lie, I feel annoyed. Right? It's annoying, isn't it? You kind of feel like you're being belittled, right? Maybe they're looking down on you. The know-it-alls, these people, it puffs them up, and he's saying, yeah, you know what? You become arrogant in this. You become prideful. You become judgmental. And that's what he's saying to them. And he's saying, knowledge, it's a good thing, but that's not what it's all about. Actually, what it's about is it's about this idea of love. He says, love is what matters most. Love must be the priority. Love is what builds up unity and faith, or unity in the faith community, right? We want to always look at things first through the lens of love. And that's what he's saying. He's saying, listen, if we're going to talk about this food sacrifice to idols, want you to look at it through the lens of love. That's what I'm going to teach you right now. And that's what we're going to take a look at. That's what we're going to take a look at right now. So then he goes on to say, so then, about eating food sacrificed, right? So he said that before, but he's like, yeah, let me just talk to you about, let's take a look at this through the lens of love. So then, about food being sacrificed to idols. Now you need to understand, how did that work? As Pete mentioned, Corinth, full of temples, full of shrines, and full of all sorts of temples where there's idol worship, and they're worshiping other gods. They're worshiping these idols that they made, and they have these temples where they would actually have an altar where they would sacrifice the food. Now, why was this important to know? Well, understand that a lot of eating would actually happen in a social context. And the social context would be people going to the temple and eating it. So what would happen is they would go to the temple and eat it. They would eat the food that was sacrificed to an idol. And if that food, or like that meat, for example, if it didn't get eaten there, it would get put into the marketplace where it would get sold to someone to eat it. So if you bought something from the marketplace, you had no idea whether it was food sacrificed to an idol or it's just whatever, because they obviously didn't have that kind of a tracking system, right? So why is that such a big deal? Well, we need to understand that those who would eat the meat, and especially like if they were, especially like they would eat the meat and it was sacrificed to idols, it was a big deal because like it actually meant that they were literally like taking in the God's being, almost like they were eating the God. It was just a weird sort of a deal. And that was the culture in which they lived. And now understand, you have Christians who understand what's going on. You have Christians who are living that way, and now they've come into a different kind of a way. Paul continues, he says, we know. Now, who's he talking about we know, right? So remember I was addressing like people here who may be kind of curious about faith or newer to the faith. Well, now he's talking about people who are kind of like mature to the faith. They're kind of like the ones who have been around for a while, right? They're the mature Christians. He says, we know that an idol is nothing at all in the world, and that there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father, from whom all things came and for whom we live. And there is but one Lord. Who's that? Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. What's Paul basically saying here? He's basically saying, listen, no such thing as the idols. These idols are not real. We serve the one true God. We serve the Creator God. We serve the one true Lord in Jesus Christ. Okay, there's no competition for deities here, guys. And guess what? Like, there's a whole bunch of you in the Church of Corinth. You know that. You're aware of that. But then he says this, but not everyone possesses this knowledge. Well, who's he referring to, not everyone? He's referring to the others in the church who may be newer to the faith, or they may be they're in the faith, but they lived really immersed in the culture, and their conscience just sort of can't get past the fact that these things aren't real, and they may be feeling confused about it. He says, but not everyone possesses this knowledge. And I think this is really interesting, because I think what it talks about is something that I think we do in the church still today, and I think Paul's kind of addressing without actually saying. In fact, look what he says. If you go to verse 4 and then verse 7, right? He says, we know that. We know the truth about the whole idol thing, but not everyone possesses this knowledge, right? So some of you know it within the church, but understand others don't know it within the church. You know what he's kind of talking about? He's kind of talking about this. Assuming. Have you ever assumed something? Right? I think we've all been caught in that, right? And Paul's kind of saying, like, you can't assume. And I think we can do a good job, especially now kind of talking to the more kind of mature and seasoned Christians in the faith, sometimes, and because I know that I'm guilty of that too, right? Sometimes I assume different things about those who might be part of the church, and they're a follower of Jesus, but maybe they're not along the journey as much as I am. Well, what kind of things do we assume? Well, we assume that, hey, maybe someone should just know better. I find it funny, and I've caught myself doing this time and time again over the years. What do you mean by, they should know better? Well, they come to know Jesus, and then it's like, well, my goodness, the next week they did this, or they said this, or they acted in this way, or what, and you're just like, oh, you should know better. What's going on? Listen, we don't give them time to grow. We just assume, well, they just know better. As soon as they just kind of accepted Jesus, then their whole life has changed, their whole way has changed, and everything's just, whoa. To the mature Christian, do you remember when you first came to faith in Jesus? Were you as mature then as you are now instantly? It's a process. It takes time, but sometimes we assume. Other times we assume that someone will conform to your beliefs. Again, guilty of it. It actually, we think that someone's going to clone my beliefs. Now, there's very important things that we want to believe in the life of the church. There's those primary things about Jesus and about salvation and all that kind of stuff. But then there's a whole bunch of secondary things as well. These things that are subject to interpretation, and we may agree to disagree. It doesn't mean we can't be in unity, but we may agree to disagree on certain things. Maybe it's about how the end times are going to come. I don't know, something like that, right? Or we may agree to disagree on other things. And sometimes we assume, right? Sometimes the mature Christian just assumes that, well, they're just going to conform and they're going to believe everything. And it's like a shock to the system when they're maybe still questioning some things, even though if you think about it, it's not a bad thing to be questioning. Sometimes we assume someone will understand. They'll just understand. In other words, it's assumed. And I always love to think about Sunday mornings in that regard. When we think about newer people to the faith, or maybe it's someone who's exploring faith, and maybe that's you today, and you've been courageous enough to connect online, or you've been courageous enough to show up at a campus, whether it's here in Waterloo or it's in Kitchener or Chatham, and you have said, you know what, I'm willing to go. So sometimes the mature Christians say, oh yeah, you know what, they're ready for the same thing. They're coming for the same reason. And they're so spiritually ready, and they're going to lift up their hands, and they're going to sing well, maybe that person's coming because someone just invited them, and they have no idea what they're getting into, and they're worried about what they're getting into. Maybe they come, and they have kids. And we got an amazing area and an amazing kids program. They may not know that and realize that, and they have their sweet little Billy or sweet little Julie, and guess what? They're looking and saying, how in the world am I going to leave you to these people? It can kind of be scary. They come and it's almost like more emotional, right? They come and it's an emotional thing at first. What's going to happen? See, we just kind of assume that, well, it's just assumed that they'll know what the experience is, and they'll just fit right in with everybody else. It's a dangerous thing to just assume. And Paul's saying the same thing. He's saying, hey guys, this is a dangerous thing to just kind of assume that this is kind of the way it is, right? We always want to be mindful that there is a wide spectrum of people on the journey of faith. There's people here who have served Jesus for over 70 years probably. And then there's people here today, whether online or at one of the campuses or right here in our central campus, who saying, I'm just kind of exploring, I'm just kind of curious. It's a beautiful thing, but we need to all be aware of that. And don't just assume. Paul says, listen, some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food, they think of it as having been sacrificed to a god. And since their conscience is weak, it's defiled. But food does not bring us near to God. We are no worse if we do not eat, and no better if we do. We're no worse if we eat, and we're no better if we do. In other words, the food part, He's saying, understand, the food's neutral. The food's neutral. The food's okay. Whether it was sacrificed to an idol or not, here's the truth. The food, it didn't affect the food. The food's fine. But you can't just assume. And some of us say, well, what? I mean, maybe some Christians say, well, who cares? And maybe that was attention. Who cares? I want to eat my meat. I want to eat my meat. I want to get my food. Who cares? I know better. Maybe they could just maybe in this attention they may have gone through to say, well, man, if I know better, like maybe they just ought to know better. And they just ought to kind of move forward and figure it out in that way. The next several verses I'm going to read are from Eugene Peterson's the paraphrase, because I think it just kind of puts it in such a great way. It says this. He says, "But God does not care when you use your freedom, God does care when you use your freedom carelessly in a way that leads a fellow believer, still vulnerable to those old associations, to be thrown off track. For instance, say you flaunt your freedom by going to a banquet thrown in honor of idols, where the main course is yummy, it's meat, and it's sacrificed to these idols. Isn't there great danger if someone still struggling over this issue sees you go into the banquet? See, the danger is that he will become terribly confused, maybe even to the point of getting mixed up himself in what his conscience tells him is wrong." That's a really interesting thing. It's kind of like Paul's giving them a warning. He's saying, hey, it's not just on them. Like, it's on you if you lead them along a path where you become a stumbling block for them. You know what a stumbling block is, right? Just think of it literally, right? I think of it like I put a block right here and I walk into it and I stumble over it. I fall into the ground, right? A stumbling block is a figurative way of saying, they trip over it and they fall into sin. I become that stumbling block, and he's given a really stern warning. He's saying, hey, you mature Christian who knows better. This isn't about you, and this isn't about the meat that you need to eat. This is about putting the other person before yourself. This is about thinking of them and not you, right? Now, he continues to say, Christ gave up his life for that person. Wouldn't you at least be willing to give up going to dinner for him? Because as you say it really doesn't make any difference. But it does make a difference if you hurt your friend terribly, risking his eternal ruin. Ouch. Risking his eternal ruin. When you hurt your friend, you hurt Christ. See, a free meal here and there, it's not worth it at the cost of even one of these, as he's kind of paraphrasing it, weak ones. So those who are kind of newer to the faith, those who have weaker consciences. So never go to these idol-tainted meals if there's any chance it will trip up one of your brothers or your sisters. I think it was about 2006 or 7-ish. Remember Hurricane Katrina? And massive hurricane kind of hits New Orleans and region, and big hurricane, but the floodwaters after, the tide that rolled in was such a disastrous thing. And about 10 months later, after it happened, we took a team from my old church down there, and I was one of the members of the team. And we worked with a local pastor there, and his church ministry was just kind of like 40 minutes east, kind of southeast of New Orleans. And if you've ever been to New Orleans and you know a little bit about New Orleans is like, they got hammered because I think they're actually like below sea level sort of thing, right? So it's like right there kind of thing on the ocean. And we finish up our week. We're leaving on the Friday morning, so it's kind of Thursday around noon, and I go up to the pastor, and I'm like, hey, so this is our last night. We would love to go into New Orleans, into kind of like the French Quarter and see Bourbon Street. We know like it's such an exciting thing, and it's kind of like people come from all over the world and all over North America to visit this. This would be amazing. And I'll never forget, he kind of looks and he says, Tim, like you don't understand. I said, well, what do you mean I don't understand? I'll just follow you. You can drive, I'll follow you. There's lots of great restaurants and different stuff like that in New Orleans and lots of neat things to see in the French Quarter and on Bourbon Street and stuff like that. But you need to understand that what you've seen a lot of is like advertising. Like I've been there, right? I live here, and there's a lot of like voodoo lounges and stuff there. There's a lot of like just bars and stuff and just sexual inappropriate stuff that's going on too. And some of this is like just kind of right out in front, and so he kind of looked at me, he's like I don't know your team. I've known them for like 5, 6 days, 7 days, but I don't know your team. I don't know what their past has been like and what they've been exposed to. I don't know what they're vulnerable to. What I do know is that there's a whole bunch of things that they could see and experience if I took you there that could ultimately become like a stumbling block for them. I don't want to be personally responsible for that. I don't want to be that stumbling block. Now, at the time, a few of us were kind of bummed out, right? I know, one person in particular just really bummed out because, there's a lot of just kind of like music and stuff going on there as well. But I look back and I think, man, that was like wisdom there. He kind of knew, and he wasn't going to become the stumbling block for our team, especially because, we're all fellow Christians, but he really didn't know what was going on. He didn't know if there's someone with a weaker conscience there. And that's what Paul's saying. He's like, you don't want to be that stumbling block. You got to remember that Christ died for that person. You could send them spiraling out of control. You don't know what's going on in their life. You don't know what's going on in their world necessarily. But you don't want to be that one. So it's better for you to act in love, and by acting in love, putting them first before yourself. So that's what Paul's ultimately saying. He's saying, listen. He's saying, love one another. Love one another. You see, love, remember he was talking about knowledge puffs up, but love builds up? He's saying love, not knowledge, should drive what we do and how we relate to others. See, that's the uniqueness of a Jesus-type kingdom. That's the uniqueness, right? It's kind of like it's countercultural. It's counterintuitive that way, right? This is what the world needs to see of the church. This is what God desires the church to be so that the world sees this kind of a church. That's what God desires, right? Is to see a holy people functioning in love and functioning in selflessness towards one another. Can I ask you, do you love people more than you love what you do? Think about that for a minute. Do you love people more? Do you love people more than you love what you do, or maybe what you could do? Some of those liberties that you have, sacrificing some of those. It's a crazy kind of love. But one thing we do know about it is that it's a considerate love, which means it's others focused. He says, I have the right to do anything, right? You got the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. If you know that there could be a potential stumbling block with someone else, he's kind of saying, listen, you need to reconsider what's going on. You need to reconsider. In fact, this is an interesting thing, right? See this word seek? Think of the idea of hide and seek, right? Like to seek, right? To go look for, to go after, right? We don't seek and go after our own good, but the good of others. There's a consideration and there's a humility kind of attached with that. It's a powerful thing, right? It's others focused, it's selfless. But then we also get this idea of crazy love, as Francis Chan calls it, right? It's like a sacrificial kind of love that he's getting to. See, knowledge puffs up, but love builds because it's considered and it's sacrificial. Look what he says. He says, if an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, hey, this has been offered in sacrifice, then don't eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I'm referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. You say, hey, if he mentions something like this, if the person mentions something like this, then don't eat it. Just let it pass. Some of us feel like we have to fix the person in the situation. Well, we know better. Notice he didn't say anything about, okay, take him on a timeout, sit him down and tell him how it really should be, and then he'll feel better about it, and then you guys can both partake of it. No, he says, wait a second, no. You see, transformation is a process, and if that person has a weaker conscience in this way, it's not about you fixing it. Why would you fix it at that moment anyways? Why would I fix it in that? You know why I would fix it in that moment? Because I want to eat the meat. Right? Honestly, right? If someone said that, oh, no way. Think about it. At the time, they could have been possibly going through famine. If someone's going to serve me meat when food's hard to get and meat costs a fortune like it does, does today, but hey, I'm going to go for the meat. It means even my motives aren't even right for trying to fix the person. Don't try to fix the person. Just let it go and sacrifice. He's saying, listen, 1 or 2 meals the odd time. Jesus died for this person. We can sacrifice. We don't want to be that kind of a stumbling block. See, that's how you love, right? You sacrifice for the sake of building relationship. You sacrifice for the sake of building that relationship. That's the kind of love that Jesus desires for us to show towards one another. Jesus died for that person. That's a huge cost. He died for all of us. So maybe I limit my freedom sometimes for the sake of others, right? Maybe I give up something for the sake of someone else, right? I can have a glass of wine, for example, but maybe I know the person I'm meeting with. Maybe there's a past with alcoholism. Maybe there's a past with alcoholism in the family. Or maybe they grew up in a religious setting that said all alcohol, everything, it's sin. Listen, you don't have to argue whether or not it's biblical or not and all that. No. You just got to understand, for the sake of the other person, you might be able to pass that time. It's not about us. And I'll ask you this question as we're going to close this morning. Do you love people more than you love what you do? Do you love people more than you love what you can do? Do you love people more than you love what you could do? Most of you don't know me, especially personally. Would you sacrifice for me? Fellow Christians, would you sacrifice for me? Would you sacrifice for the person 2 rows in front of you? It's a good question to be able to process and to be able to ask. Imagine a church who values this to the core. I think we do value it for sure, but we can always get better, right? Imagine if we got even better at doing this. Imagine a region of people like Corinth, let's say KW region, over 500,000 people. Imagine how if some of those people came and sort of experienced Creekside Online or Creekside Kitchener or Creekside Waterloo, and then we talk about Chatham, Kent, and maybe they came to Creekside Chatham. Imagine if they experienced this kind of one anotherness and this kind of love and this kind of unity. I mean, you know what? It's contagious. It's kind of like, you know how I like food? You know what I like? Fresh bread. Ever smell fresh bread? It's like, you're just looking for it, right? It's, oh, this is great. Imagine being that contagious. You see, that's God's desire for his church, because ultimately, he paid the ultimate price in sacrifice so that we could experience that love and grace, and we're called as a faith community to pay it forward and to show it to one another and to be examples to the world, because we desire to be more like Jesus. It really is, at the end of the day, Jesus is the answer. Would you pray with me? God, thank you so much for your love for us. God, for your crazy love, for your love, God, that calls us to live differently. It shows us a different way. It shows us a better way. It shows us the way. Now, the bar's set high, God, but God, help us to be a faith community that just kind of like goes for it. Father, would you guide us and lead us and help us to become more like Jesus, loving one another, God, in that sacrificial way that honors you. And I pray this in your all-powerful name, Jesus. Amen.